You're good.
Hi, I'm Jason, and I know most of you. You know most of you know me. And I'm supposed to introduce myself. I came to some of the early CJUG meetings back when we were in the Adobe building, shortly after the first release. And it occurred to me, in all this time, this is my first demonstration or presentation for the CJUG. I thought that was kind of too long. So currently, my interests are open source software. My current job, we work on an open source stack, and I took it primarily to work on an open source stack. I'm interested in open government, and that's most of my hobby activities are around open government, trying to daylight legislation information. Make it easier for citizens to track lawmaking. And part of that effort is I have a couple open source projects that I've created to make my own work more fun. And thank you for having me here tonight to share one of them with you. It's called Fado, and it's related to flamenco. It's actually an acronym, and at the end of the presentation I'm going to have people other than George guess what the acronym means. And so I apologize. A friend of mine, Nate, said that I had to migrate over to GitHub. It's still on Google, and I have most of my projects on GitHub, but I haven't seen them, probably need, but maybe you guys will change my mind.
Google is evil?
I'm sorry?
Google is evil?
I give you the reason.
So what Fado is I believe, an improved way or a renewed or rediscovered way to do database programming from within your app. It's SQL-centric. And so now most of us use tools like an ORM, like Hibernate or Toplink, or EJB or JPA. They're all kind of the same flavor. And different dialects or different approaches or strategies or implementations. And this ORM problem or challenge, it starts out of, I didn't have time to do a neat little graph to show you how when you start out on a project using ORM, you can get in really low, and it's got a fairly low floor, and you can get pretty far, and then you hit a complexity threshold, and it skyrockets. And that's what it was an essay or a blog report, a thesis of Ted Newert. Is his name Newert or Newert?
Newert.
Newert. He wrote The Vietnam of Computer Science, where he explores this issue. And that came out in like 2007, and there really hasn't been any movement on this issue. So back when I was a junior Power Ranger writing Access software, using Visual Basic and DBase 2 and Fox Pro, it was pretty neat. Actually, I'll just preview. So there was me and my work. And everything was simple. And what we called back then the style of development was work group computing. And your application for internal corporate development and the database were very tightly coupled, especially with Fox Pro or Access. And that was characterized in retrospect as the database was just a file handle. You had direct access to it. Even in a LAN or a workgroup situation, everybody kind of opened up the same database and shared that resource. And then maybe late 80s, early 90s, we went into this client-server world, where it's now, instead of a file handle, it's a socket connection. So you have your application, and you have your database. They're still on different machines, but how you communicate with them and how the communication is coordinated changed. As the client server, I guess, is a little bit like timeshare or something like that. So I have the and here, and I tried to find a lightning thing to show electricity, and I couldn't find one. So this is to signify the socket connection. So what happens when you're doing access development, for example? Does anybody remember doing VBA, et cetera? Your application, you're typing along, it was tightly coupled, so all of your accessors, your variables were typed, or varchar, but typed, and when you changed something, it percolated through your build. And it was nice. There was no like leap of faith or intelligence loss. But when we went to client server, what happened was the application lost the contact with the database schemas. And that lightning bolt is represented by an API that you all know is ODBC, and in Java it's JDBC. And so this is what happened. This is a dramatization of, there's happy Jason with his happy work, and when we went to client server, something got in the way of that work. A 100-pound angry gorilla. And like some form of intelligence was lost once we switched to the JDBC, ODBC. And the ORM solutions, they have three things that you have to weigh against each other. The schemas, the mappings, and the POJOs. And it's kind of a triangle, and they don't quite fit together. And I was at a startup in Ballard. We were doing electronic medical records, and I got to do greenfield development. And I worked through this. Because it was greenfield, I was like, hey, I'm going to use the perfect hibernating mappings. This is going to be brilliant. And I went through it 3 times, and it never really gelled. I kind of got it to work. I wasn't happy with it. But that Vietnam of computer science, where the relational and the object model don't really mesh, and you have to go through hoops to get them to kind of mesh, like many-to-many mappings and subclassing, etc. But what struck me most about this development model was this is the workflow when you're doing ORM. You do your mapping stuff, then you do your Java, and then you capture, the SQL is generated, and you capture that. And you're like, oh man, it doesn't work. What's going wrong? And so you capture it, you go over to Query Analyzer, you fart around with it until something works, and then you go back to the front again and try to figure out how to get the ORM tool to emit the SQL that you want. We're familiar with this, right? Nods of agreement, of course. And so I actually have a confession. My buddy Richie couldn't make it here tonight, but I set up this clinical data backend for our portal product. And I did not anticipate that we would have so many customizations for all the different hospitals that were using our backend. And I'm not a details kind of person, so Richie was the one who had to figure out that move. Because when I looked at it, I did the first couple, and it took me too long, and that was kind of my response. I just don't understand what's going on, and I don't have much patience for that kind of work. So the way that Fado works, in contrast, is more like what you would use, or what you would see with Access or DBase 2, is you have your schemas, there's your database, and then you have your queries. So in Access, it was dynamic queries, and you get to play around with them in the below field and see the results. And what that does is it changes the workflow. So the development model is you get your SQL correct first, or tune it, or defer it to your DBAs to make something useful or happy, and then you work on your Java. And so it flips the workflow. And in process improvement, like the books and the consultants, et cetera, they call that one-way flow. Like the work all flows one direction. Whereas with the ORM world, constantly looping, back channel communication. And that has been my goal for quite a while with Fado, is to support the one-way flow of development. So forgive me on the demo. I'm trying to switch context here. I was still putting together this slide deck about a half hour before I got in the car. So I'll show you what I do. I use Fado most days. I mentioned the project. There's a secret code word for my legislation information system. It's called Legirati, like Illuminati, insiders. Impressive, right? So I have a series of queries. This one's pretty simple. I'm going to close all these up. You guys will recognize this squirrel. So I have a little script here that just generates the person and the pet tables and then populates it with CSV. Is that in the way? Sorry. And I just want to show you that it works. Okay, so here's our results. Oh yeah, that kind of looks good. That's the data that I expected back. This is the, I'm going to bounce around a lot. If that makes anybody nauseated, please, I apologize. So this is the CSV file I set up a few hours ago just to have some data to look at. And here's our results. Now I want to take this query that I've refined in my SQL tool, and I will replace this, and I go to my handy dandy code generator. It runs. So this line right here, it found that SQL and it generated a Java file, or 2 Java files. And what those Java files are, we'll look at the generated code. Sorry. There's one that wraps the select, the query, and the other wraps the result set made from that query. And so if we go through, the object browser, there's no parameters here in the select statement, but let's look at the code for a second. This is generated by Fado from the original SQL. Oops, I messed up, I'm sorry. I have 2 of these bad boys. So this is the original SQL that I input, and this is the setup. If I look down into this, and I'll run it in just a second so we can see what happens, you'll see, well, I'm skipping ahead. Let me show you the result set. So in the original SQL query, we had the resulting columns were first and last. And the result set wrapper that's generated, it has accessors that are type safe for first and for last.
What you're calling surname?
I'm sorry?
What you're calling surname?
Yeah, so Linus has I skipped ahead in my demo. He noticed that the original field name was last, and Fado picked up the alias. So I'll be able to skip that step a little bit later. And so let's see how this works. So this is my code, and so I feel really cramped on this little screen. And I'm sorry, it's pretty bouncy around. It's not my big iMac screen. So I'll just add this here, surname. And this is pretty basic stuff. It's nothing surprising. But what is really cool is, and I got okay as I was trying to work on this demo, or script it or whatever, this is how I work when I'm working on my projects. So I'll set a breakpoint, and I'll just run it. And so, I've created the query, and it's a convention to call, the SQL file is called person.sql or personselect.sql. That's just a convention. There's no hard and fast rule. I just find it easier to have the query operation be the last word, because then when it percolates out to the Java class system, person select, person insert, person update. And then the conditions that you add later, can just go on to the end of the name. So I'm going to look at that select statement. And this is a very simple example, but I can't remember what this query is doing. I'm going to look at it. Oh, look, it tells me what it is. Cool. And then I added this here so that it would show quick results during this demo. It's just to dump the result set. And that's what you see in the bottom here is first, surname, and the names. So this is the result set wrapper. You can still get access to the original JDBC result set and do everything that you need to do. And it's similar with the select statement here. You can still get access to the original prepared statement. This is just a wrapper. It's not a subclass. It's not a hider or anything like that. And I'll comment this out in the next iteration so that we don't have to see it dumped down. Now I go through my iteration, which is pretty straightforward, and I can see what the first row is. And as I step through the iteration, in my debug window, I get to see the information. And that's that toString method that the debugger is calling is auto-generated by Fado. Oops, apologies. And so we print it out. Okay, that looks pretty good. Go to the next one. Oh, it's George. Okay. So if nothing else, the Fado wrappers are really easy to debug and inspect. Yes, Newman?
So does it look up type information from like the database metadata?
Exactly.
To map to the Java types?
Yes.
Is there, how much control do you have over that? Or have you felt the need to have control over that?
Your control is through the DDL.
Okay, so whatever you choose to be, the types or whatever.
Right.
Okay.
So you create the database and it uses those types as is. Like some JDBC data types map back as big decimal and big number. That's inconvenient. But do you really want to? You can either have data loss or you can go and change your schema.
So it looks at the database and pulls out that?
Yes. Maybe I should go to that slide next. Since these questions, I'm sorry. What's going on here? What Fado does is it compiles your SQL into JDBC wrappers. Conditions in your SQL get mapped to or generated into prepared statement parameters. And columns, in your select columns, get mapped or generated, result set accessors. It gets the data from the DDL of the database. It inspects the database. But it does another thing. Because your SQL statement can have type conversions, calculated values, wildcards, it also runs the SQL that you provide and examines the result set to see what those columns are going to be. So it does a dry run of the SQL. So it examines the original schema to pull out all the conditions, and it examines the result set to figure out what the resulting columns will be. So you get the type safety. But it also adds some convenience methods, and I'll show some of those, like for null checking, which is kind of a bummer with the JDBC wrapper right now. So the conditions that are supported right now is a fairly straightforward vocabulary. The operators like the in, like if you have a value in a list, and between two values. And the result columns can be straight named, aliases, like Linus saw as surname, computed values or wildcard. So I'll show some of those. I'll skip ahead to a more meaty example. I really dislike Squirrel. There's a nice SQL development environment in IntelliJ that is loose SQL file-based instead of connection-based, and I haven't made the transition over to IntelliJ yet. So this query, select a person who's 30, has, you know, we're making sure that the SQL works. Bring it over to our environment. I thought it was easier to continue to modify the existing file instead of keep adding for the purpose of this demo. Recreate it. Now you see me recreating it, running this profile. Uh-oh, it didn't work.
Table not found.
Maybe we should be using this.
At least it gives you a meaningful message.
Yeah. This is nice. I don't know why that didn't work. Let's try a different one and see if that works. I'll show a wild card. Did I kill my database? This is the right file, right? I really want this to work. Okay, that one worked. Maybe I just zigged when I should have zagged. From person. I should have a soundtrack. Why didn't that work? So this is the dump of the grammar that it parsed it. This is JSON debug mode, trying to figure out what went wrong. This is the abstract syntax tree from Antler. This is not very useful to you.
What?
This is my inexperience making Java grammars. What am I doing wrong here? Anyone see it?
Is that weird white space in there by any chance?
I was wondering.
Oh, there's an underscore in front of the from.
That's in the margin.
Oh, okay.
There, age. Huh. Oh, let's skip that into a different one. How could that not work? This is terrible. And now, well, the weird / stupid part is I just tried all these. Do I have a
The new database running?
yeah. Table not found. Let's go back to the original query. How does this work? But that one doesn't.
Jason, could there be some traded white space on person?
There might be. We're just going to fill this out so that we can move on with the demo. So I apologize. Oh! How is that possible?
It's not like I'm aware.
It's not like I'm aware.
Yeah.
What am I doing wrong? Just verify this. I swear to God it worked when I left the building.
Work on it on your iMac, right?
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I need the.
Add the age. I think the problem is the age.
You think it's with the age?
That's the only difference between them.
Is there an age column?
I'm sorry. Well, distributed debugging, right? Well, that's going to be really embarrassing if it's not working. It's dying on the web. I don't know why. Well, it's going to be a short demo.
But the effect is only that it would just filter what you already got before. It would just filter.
So I will show you other examples.
Looks like it's expecting the end of line,
Yeah.
not the end of file.
Bummer.
Now put the where age it on it again. Make
sure you do an enter at the end of that line.
Okay. That's going to be embarrassing. No. Oh well. So I'll show you other examples. So my super secret project called Legirati, and there are all sorts of examples of SQL that I use. So this is an example. Is I wonder if I need an order by in there. Anyway, so this is fairly standard SQL. It's a subset of SQL 92. None of this is all that far out there, but what it does do, let me show you. This is the Fado grammar space right now, and I've implemented the features that I need for my work. And so it supports all the conditionals, all the result columns. It supports all the joins. It does not, and it also supports functions. It does not support at this time the nested select statements. So that's something new that would be above and beyond what HQL and JPQL does. So these two, there's some overlap. There's some stuff that Fado does that JPQL does not do, and vice versa, currently. I would like to get it up to the SQL 92 dialect. And then, maybe in the future, if there was enough development resources, the grammars for the various vendors, and those aren't just simply dialects, like difference between returning the top results. They actually have syntactic and feature differences. And that would be quite a bit more work.
You guys not all about how you would do subselects?
Yeah, I just have to recurse down. It's
So you have like inner classes, and it's generating inner classes for your outer classes.
oh no, it doesn't need to do that. It's it creates the parse tree, and it just would, every time it finds a select, just drill down. And because it's descend first, the replacement of the parameters for the prepared statements, taking one of those values and replacing it with a question mark would be in order. So how I said what Fado does. How Fado works is it parses the SQL, it extracts the conditions in the columns, it gathers the metadata, and it does code generation. And there are currently 3 different templates for the JDBC wrappers. And I used Velocity because at the time that I started this project, Velocity was really straightforward. It was the one that I knew the best. And so the select template's the easiest. So once it pulls the metadata out of the query, then just passes it to the template, and it's pretty straightforward as a code generation device. And I really like this kind of development. I believe that code generation shouldn't be like mapping files and a compiler and it generates all this goo. The worst example is the C++ templates. What I think code generation should be tailored after is work that you would do for yourself if you only had more time. And so each one of these templates, the reason that we write our DAOs instead of doing what we do like this now is because it's a lot of work, and we want to bypass that work. So for the insert statements, the result sets, the updates, I tailored them how I wanted the resulting code to always look, and then I turned that code into templates. And there's a special case here it's an experimental template. It's the updatable result set and the updatable select that go along with that. So I don't know if anybody uses JDBC updatable result sets. If certain conditions are met, where there's an ID field and you don't do any joins, you can modify that result set and write those changes back to the database. And it's kind of like junior ORM. And do we remember once? I don't know why I can't go back and forth through these slides. Yes, George?
So I was wondering, did you ever give any thought to generating your own output directly so that you could potentially have different classes standing in for different kinds of conditions? Instead of having to list them in your templates to handle this kind of condition and this kind of condition.
More like an affluent API?
Yeah.
No. So it occurred to me while I was preparing for this, like this slide here, I was trying to compare the different strategies that have come up since client server arose. The joke, and I think there's a couple others, JPA and Link as well, they're kind of fluent-ish. There's no reason you couldn't take that SQL query, come up with another template, to, like a velocity style template, to generate any kind of code that is reproducible. So,
I think maybe we're the question. I misphrased the question. It isn't that SQL is the wrong choice. I thought that the question is did you look at when you having a different model for going from your metadata out to your Java, so that you didn't have to have basically a skip trace of this.
So what
for different kinds of conditions.
What the metadata is a composite. It's a statement which would be either select, insert, update, and then it's got its columns, and then contained in that is its conditions, and those can be nested. So as a composite, you could iterate through that and do code generation, similar to how the velocity does.
Right.
So
you didn't.
I don't do that. Okay. And if you really wanted to, you could use the templating, because the metadata is the same, to code generate any of these other things. Like, for example, MyBatis has SQL in it, but it also has all the heavyweight stuff of the mapping files and the projects. You could generate all that stuff. You could also, I looked at other languages, I'm mostly a Java developer, but any language that has a wrapper for ODBC is a candidate for making templates for. So the kind of customizations that Fado could do is, on the front end, pluggable grammars, for Oracle, Microsoft, whatever, and on the back end, pluggable languages, by simply swapping out the templates. And it wouldn't change the infrastructure of Fado at all. So, the Ted Newart's essay was written in 2006, 2007. I've been complaining about database development on the CJED list since way before then. And why Fado now? And it follows the evolution of Antler as a grammar tool. And the latest, the prior to latest version of Antler is a real enabler. So in the 2x days, the abstract syntax tree and the parse tree were different. And if you've done, I can show you the Antler grammar, or the Fado grammar.
Can you define those things? I'm not sure what an abstract syntax tree is.
So an abstract syntax tree is closest to the Banir form. It's like the idealized description of the language, whereas the parse tree is a trace of all the rules that it hit. Well, it was really, really brutal for someone with a small mind like me, trying to figure out, I'm sorry, I'm looking at Legirati. And this is a very straightforward grammar. You don't see any, there's two basic strategies to dealing with the difference between the abstract syntax tree and the parse tree. One of them was you embed Java commands inside your grammar that calls a builder that kind of builds up what you want to deal with. The other is you use rewrite rules. Did I say, is that enough syllables? Tree rewrite rules to emit the kind of parse tree that you eventually want to deal with. Well, that changed with 3x. It went from LLK to LL star, or LL and then went something. The grammar got more expressive. And because the grammar does left refactoring, which I barely understand, you know, I just noodle with the grammar to get it working right. The abstract syntax tree and the parse tree are the same. I was like, wow, this makes it all easier. And so the big insight that occurred, and Terrence Parr, who creates Antler, about the same time also just, you know, started to embrace this strategy, is instead of doing tree rewriting, builders, all sorts of goofy stuff, tree walkers, is the grammar emits a domain object model look-alike thing, that's the abstract syntax tree, and it completely separates the lexer, the parser, and then the compiler/interpreter, which is a new thing in grammar technology, or grammar compiler technology. It's pretty cool. And what's happening with the Antler that's out today, 4x, is the grammars are even more powerful, more expressive. And so, you know, when you read a spec sheet and it shows you the EBNF, the enhanced Bach-Neuer form, whatever. So grammar development will be quite a bit more powerful and more accessible to us mere mortals, because we won't have to try to figure out how to do left factoring and rules. So this is what happens. Like, I've made many, many attempts to try to get something like Fado up. I tried a jock type solution, I've tried grammar builders, I've tried all sorts of things. But this is what enabled it to happen, is went from combination 2x, 3x, 4x, combination of a parser and a builder to a generator, because you just couldn't handle variability like that, in that way. From a parser and a rewriter to a generator, where you take that resulting parse tree and then slice and dice it into a new form. And then now what we have is a parser to a DOM or a tree, then to a generator. And this has clean separations between the three steps.
That's what compilers look like.
You hope they look like that, but typically the parser bleeds into the compile/interpret step. It's really difficult not to embed rules in your grammar that is meta information used downstream by the compiler. And as an example, so this is the grammar, and that generates a parse tree that looks like a domain object model. What happens with the generator is it drills down through, actually that's a bridge too far. It drills down through the grammar. It interprets not the grammar, the parse tree, using XPath style statements. So now that you have this domain object model, kind of, actually you might remember Java ML. It was the XMLification of Java, right? Now you have this kind of syntax neutral representation of your query or Java code. Now you can drill down and find stuff using XPath. And so that's, I did it myself with Antler 3x. Antler 4x will have it built in. So this is the future for Fado. And apart from fixing that grammar bug that won't find the where clause. So the most immediate productivity booster for me in my day-to-day operations would be to have a better plugin for Eclipse or now IntelliJ IDE support. So we're on Eclipse for something else, Kepler or Kepler or whatever. Well, back in the Juno days, I wrote an Eclipse plugin for Fado, and so when you change stuff, it did the incremental recompile, and that was brilliant. And then I upgraded to Eclipse 4 and broke. And then I spent a lot of time getting it to work, and I just decided life's too short. I'm not doing this anymore. And so that's why I'm leaving the Eclipse platform, because it's everything about our development is it's for what we should be focused on for productivity enhancements is shortening the edit pile debug loop, getting faster results, faster feedback. Then perhaps the next step would be to have full SQL 92 support, and to, at the same time that I would move to full SQL 92, I would also move over to Antler 4X, because 3X is about 3 years old now. It would be better, Fado would be better if it had testing enhancements. I don't know how the world does unit tests for database development. I just write a lot of code to make sure and hope that it keeps working. I have a bunch of different sample apps that I work on that try to exercise it differently. I've looked at unit testing for grammars, I've looked at unit testing for database development, and I really don't have a clear goal or idea of what's to do there. And so I'm open to suggestions. One thing that we all use when we're doing ORMs is some kind of cache. And when you now have a wrapper for JDBC, where's the cache go? And so it occurs to me that we will need to have a caching JDBC driver, so that not just the connection and result prepared statement caching, but also the results caching and invalidation. So moving it back to where it should be, in my opinion. And I already mentioned the pluggable grammar and the pluggable templates. So I believe that's my, I'm really sorry that didn't work, but this is a debate that I've had with George many a time over the last 2 years, is when to use ORM versus Fado. And ORM is quite useful when you have a pretty strong mapping between your tables and your projects, when they're roughly equivalent. And when you need to do read-write, like get some rows, modify them, push them back, via the same code path, which in my work I often don't do. And also, ORMs are really good for the consulting mercenary class, to extract as much money as you can out of your unwitting clients. So, Fado, which I discovered through working on that healthcare IT project, where Hibernate just kind of gums up the works when you need to do a lot of joins. So we were doing a lot of report writing where we had to joins across multiple tables and deeply nested joins. So if you have more than a handful of HQLs or JPQLs in your code, then you should just move over to Fado. And in contrast to the ORM consultant-friendly, fee-friendly approach, you should use Fado if you just want to get your work done. So one last point that I had to make is we've all tried to debug these goofy frameworks that we use. It's like, what's going on in this code? And you step in and there's a proxy and there's a wrapper and there's some code-generated stuff, aspects, blah, blah, blah. And my, say, happiness debugging or working with code is loosely correlated with how deep the stack trace is. And you know what I'm talking about with like Hibernate trying to figure out what's going on. And so the Fado approach has a very, very shallow stack. And the code type things that I try to do have a very shallow. I can figure out what's going on through code inspection. I just remembered that while I was destroying Fado, I was getting my other demo up and running. And I'm going to punish you all with it right now, because the code's already generated. So I'll show you an example of, a better example of Fado in action. So this, I needed a sample application to validate Fado with, and the web framework that I'm working on called Martini. So this is a course catalog. The data set comes from the office. And so I open that in a new tab. So it's retrieving the data using queries that were kind of canned and then slaved to this web page. And so that's a select query. And if I save this now, that's an update query. And in the code, it's pretty straightforward. So, oh, by the way, Ambrose is Monk's brother, the agoraphobe. You guys watch Monk? So this is the select course details query. So this feeds that web page that you're seeing. It's pretty straightforward. And these are the conditions. And we can look at, oh, and I'll show you the update before we move on. So this is the update statement. What's really bitchin' about Fado is if I get this update command working, these values are used as the default placeholders in the prepared statement. So never again will you be trying to do your prepared statement say uninitialized value.
So when you have that SQL there and you generate the update class, it'll have setters for all of those fields, and if you don't set them, they will have those default values. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So it automatically, so you can put whatever you want in there.
Right, because it's, so this is the original, or this is the generated. So these are all, from here to here the columns, and these are the accessors. And if we go and look at the original, where are those values? Let's find out where this is initialized. So those initial values were mapped into.
Why do you have accessors for the update class?
So you may want to use it again. So it's getters and setters. Maybe you don't need getters, but you can pass it around.
That'd be good for debugging purposes too. Logging.
Yeah. And the select course details is a very similar type thing. This is the wrapper for the select statement, and the setters, let's see, ATP stands for academic time period. Set the course number, set the department. And these setters have the same, or also use the default values from the original SQL. And so this value right here is slurped into right there. So what this enables is you get your query working in Squirrel, and then you run it through the code generator, and it should be the exact same query, and then you can do your diff testing. And so I think I just wanted to show you that it does work. Nimrit.
So is the idea behind the workflow here that you basically blow away the generated classes each time that you change the schema, regenerate all the code basically?
So
or change the SQL, I guess.
The queries will blow up or may blow up if the schema changes. And you want to know that immediately. So that's one big difference between the Fado workflow and all the mapping-based workflows, is Fado will blow up earlier, you know, at the compile stage, code generation stage, instead of at runtime. And if your schema is changing underneath you and you're not notified, you know, those DDAs, you've got other problems. I've thought about, you know, ways to send, you know, to detect at runtime that queries have died or busted, or, you know, to do the metadata scraping at runtime, but I think you have other problems if your schema is changing.
I might have missed something, but this is all based on JDBC. So surrounding your queries is just you're just doing programmatic JDBC, or what are you doing there?
So I think let me show the code generated for the select statement. Maybe that will be. So if I wanted to see what the SQL is looking like in the debugger, this is kind of a preview of what happens when you execute it. It gets the original SQL, that's this.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, if we scroll down far enough, we'll see where the original conditions were replaced with parameters. And then they're replaced with the parameters. If I execute this, it's creating a, where's the execute method? It's creating a prepared statement. And if you have a JDBC connection caching implementation ahead of your normal JDBC driver, it will give you the same prepared statement again.
And where is it getting the connection from?
So you pass in the connection as a parameter. So the client code looks,
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm asking.
so the client code looks like this. So I say, give me a connection, instantiate the select, and if there was parameters there, I would set the parameters. Select, set, age or whatever, param, 100. And then that recompile didn't work, to my everlasting shame and heartbreak. And then when you execute it, just as you would with JDBC, you pass in the connection, and it returns the result set. And then this is a wrapper for the original result set, which is still there, and then you iterate over it.
So I guess presumably you could be using something like Spring and like to manage your transactions, and so as long as you can get the connection from Spring, then you can do whatever you want with it.
Right,
I'm just
right.
trying to think this through, yeah.
Yeah, it makes no judgment on any of that stuff, because you can get direct access to the underlying JDBC to start a transaction, to roll it back.
And so, so then you're also encapsulating for people all the checked exceptions from JDBC, or how's that?
That's a good question. It just throws them, whatever it finds. So in this execute here, it just tosses it out. So what happens, you know, I'm doing my martini as like a servlet wrapper in the same kind of way. I just catch that exception and deliver an error, you know, and handle it to the user. So it's not wrapping the SQL exception or burying it, and because the stack trace is so short, it should be closer to where you can actually do something about it. Yes, sorry, Dan. Dan first.
So you say you use metadata. Does that mean that if your DDL had, constraints and stuff like that, or stuff like that, you could sort of check it in here, or would you build that in?
That's a pretty good idea.
So,
No, I haven't gotten that far. I hadn't even thought of that. That's a really good idea. To copy forward the hard-coded constraints in your database.
right.
That's a pretty good idea.
I mean, since your starting point is the SQL,
Yeah.
you should pull as much of that out, it seems.
And that was a recent discussion And I've done a lot of constraints debugging because, I think we have 5 constraints checking layers in our current stack, and it's brutal figuring out where something failed. So that's a really good idea. I'll look into that. Doug?
Can you say more about the difference between this and the Legirati one? I thought the Legirati is all based around a generator too, right? I mean, there is a tool that's all about generation.
I think there's an out-of-band tool that does the generation.
Yeah,
I've never used it.
Yeah, second part, but it seems like that's fundamental to the architecture.
The impression that I had was that it was metadata based. Like it wasn't DDL based. It was their description of the problem, like a more terse or concise description of the mapping that then generated the mapping as this. It wasn't slaved to the SQL schema.
It's a slave to SQL
Is
schema.
it?
It just limits the subset. If you have 100 tables, you'll say, I'm interested in only
Oh, that's
10.
cool. So, yeah, I've not used that part.
Did you look at the squirrel? Squirrel. That's basically the same compiled type safe SQL implemented in Scala.
Oh, so it's more of a DSL?
It's
like that link?
Yeah, DSL,
Yeah.
you would say, but it's pretty much SQL.
I haven't looked at that.
Second question, I guess, question. It seems like the really hard part of this does seem to be the parsing of the SQL. And once you've got that, you've kind of fallen most of the way there. Is that really an unsolved problem? Because I couldn't find, I really went and looked for the same thing one time, tried to find a Java parser or SQL. It's like, this isn't, it seems like it's unsolved, which is crazy.
So,
New people trying to write this?
that is my thesis, is what happened when we went to a socket connection was the parser that Access and all those environments have didn't make it over.
Yeah.
And so I'm replacing it.
These Anta guys haven't done this, and it's like, there's a demo of how cool their tool is. It's like, here's the whole SQL parser.
But I thought the Java DB was in the open source.
So I looked at the Derby parser, and I looked at the H2 database parser, and there's a few loose parsers for Hitler. And parsers are worse than like macro code or Perl. You really need to be inside the head of the developer or alongside them or something. I tried really hard to use someone else's parser, SQL parser.
Other people have done it, but
Yeah, it seems like anything. Yeah.
What happens is something like the H2 parser, which was the least opaque of the parsers that I tried to. I really didn't want to do this from scratch, right, years ago. And the H2 parser was the least opaque, and it was so idiosyncratic to that style that I couldn't figure out how to extend it or customize it for different dialects.
Is the parser code that you have separate from Fado itself, or is it actually, is there a separation there in your architecture? Because it's great to pull the parser, whether or not you take it.
Yeah, that's one of the neat things that's enabled by Antler 3x and even more so in 4x. And something I'm looking forward to is this parser is completely standalone, and you can see by the shout out, I swipe stuff from other people's parsers. And the one little kind of quirk in my grammar versus the parsers that I based my work on is creating the parse tree. I'm using XPath statements to drill down the parse tree to find the conditions. Like a condition where it's one row to another row, or one field to another field, I don't have an opportunity to convert that into a prepared statement parameter. Where it's a field to computed, or to a value, I can use that. So I have to inspect the parse tree. It has to be very carefully constructed so that it can be inspected, so that there's nodes to make decisions off of for the drill down, which is different from the other grammars. When it comes time to do an Oracle grammar, a Microsoft grammar, etc., they'll have to add, it's almost just keeping track of the decisions, how they got down to that root, to those leaf nodes, so that the XPath statements can find the parts that it's looking for. It's no different than screen scraping. Like I've done a lot of screen scraping for XML and HTML, and it's like, oh God, if they just added another div here, I could have. It's exactly like that. So, yes, Stan.
So what, when you do an insert statement, what gets returned when you do an executed insert? You get like say if I have an auto-generated ID field, do I get that back?
That's a really good question, and I forget the answer, so let's look. Because that generated field thing was, I was really curious what was going to be required. Because like Hibernate, you have key generators that are pluggable. Actually, Legirati has some of those. See, Mark, if you can figure out how to get out. And some people snore when they fall asleep. Did you guys see that? Oh, I'm there. So the execute for the insert that was generated, this was the original insert. Hey, put your phone number in there. So it's at the end here, it's doing get generated keys, and then it works just like the ResultSet or the JDBC does. Is you have to, after you get the count, then ask it what the generated key was. I forgot. So this is the prepared statement. It's executed, and then you ask, get the generated key from it. And if you don't have a strategy there for a generated key, like it's not an auto increment field or whatever, you get 0. So you should probably pass that in. All right. Well, thank you for your indulgence. I'm deeply embarrassed. I will fix it. You know it.
So that'll be in the next presentation, right? All right. Well, thanks, Jason.
Thank you.